Hey everybody, this is Jessica and Noam here for another episode of Drums Through the Decades, where we cover the evolution of drums over the course of the last 70 years, and today we are going to be talking about the 1970s.
The 70s were a huge decade for drum recording. Everything went from monophonic drums to stereophonic drum recording. They started adding in close mics, and because of that, track counts got bigger and bigger. Drums became more impactful and more important to the sound of the record, and some of the best drummers of the 20th century got recorded in that decade.
There are quite literally tens of thousands of fantastic drum recordings from the 70s, and we've actually covered a lot of those in our What's That Sound series, which you can check out. But today we're going to be focusing on Fame by David Bowie and Black Dog by Led Zeppelin.
In the 1960s, it was an explosion of creativity and technological advances. All of these things like track count and fidelity were increasing at such a rate that it was really shaping the sound. By the 1970s, it became less about the technology and more about the way that they were using all of their tools. People started recording things in stereo, people started stretching the bounds of what drums could sound like, and started getting way more creative with the way that they were using the drums in the records. The choices that they started making in the 70s set the tone for the 80s and the 90s as far as how drums were being dealt with.
As in decades past, the music being recorded was drastically changing as well. Pop music was becoming more sophisticated, rock music was becoming heavier, and entirely new genres such as disco and heavy metal were being born. With all of these new flavors, engineers were challenged to create drum sounds that matched, and with that, let's get into our first track, Black Dog by Led Zeppelin.
When you talk about 1970s drums, it's impossible not to mention one of the absolute monsters of the decade, John Bonham. His drumming in Led Zeppelin is considered some of the best drums ever recorded, and the sound was massive. Black Dog was recorded in 70 and 71 at Island Studios and Headley Grange. The engineer was Andy Johns, and the producer was Jimmy Page.
John Bonham famously played Ludwig drums throughout his career, and by the time they recorded Led Zeppelin 4, he would have been using a Ludwig Super Classic Green Sparkle. Today we have a 1999 Ludwig Classic Maple kit, thanks to our friend Adam Hansen. The sizes of this kit are almost exactly what John Bonham used, except we have a 14 by 12 high tom instead of a 14 by 10. But the two floor toms, the 16 by 16 and 18 by 16, are the same, and we also have the absolutely massive 26 by 14 inch kick drum. For our snare, we have a 1970s Ludwig 402 Supraphonic, and he also famously used Paiste cymbals, so we do have 14 inch Paiste 602s. We have a 16 inch Paiste Fast Crash, and then also a 20 inch Giant Beat Paiste Crash. For our ride, however, we used a Zildjian 21-inch K-Suite.
For the drum sound of Led Zeppelin, we are coming from the 60s, which the mentality was to use very minimal mics and record to very minimal tracks. Now, by the end of the 60s, the mics started getting a little more extensive. By the late 60s Beatles stuff, there was some more mics happening, but still the track count was pretty low. And by the 70s, we're really getting into 16 tracks, and they start spreading things out onto more and more tracks. This is going hand in hand with our stereophonic drum recording. Previously, stereo was existing, but they were, for the most part, just panning things left and right. The drums still very much were mono drums. Now we are getting this stereo image of a drum set, which is hi-hat over on the left, floor tom on the right. It's kind of the feeling of sitting down at the drum kit. The early points of this, they were still thinking of it in terms of getting the track count low. So rather than close miking everything and sending everything to its own channel, instead they were trying to use a minimal amount of miking to capture a stereo image of the entire drum kit as a whole. In this case, we are going to 3 mics and we're using something called the Glyn Johns method. Andy Johns is Glyn Johns' brother. He is using his brother's famous technique on this. The basics of the technique is this. You have one mic that is an overhead mic. This is what you would have typically used for a mono drum recording. On top of that mic, you add a second mic, which is kind of a behind the shoulder, looking across the kit, over by the floor tom microphone. This is the one that you're using to create the stereo image. You take the overhead mic, you pan it slightly to the left, you take the mic that is over your shoulder, you pan it slightly to the right, and you get an image of the entire kit. The reason that they're putting things in this kind of weird formation is they're trying to get everything from the drum set picked up. In mono drum recording, when you would go through a drum fill, you would start with this really loud rack tom and then your fill would get kind of quieter as you went, and by the time you got to the floor tom, it would be really quiet. We are putting a mic right by the floor tom, so we get this very kind of in-your-face direct image of the floor tom, and we also get this width because the floor tom is going to be way louder in one microphone than the other mic. So because we're using 2 mics now and they are stereo mics, meaning they're getting panned separately, we have to start thinking about the phase relationship between the 2 mics. With mono miking, you are still thinking about phase, but it's a different sort of thing because the phase is happening electrically in the speakers. With stereophonic recording, the phase is happening in the room, meaning that one speaker is playing one microphone, one speaker is playing the other microphone, and the phase interaction has not already happened when it came out of the speakers. The phase interaction happens in our brain. It happens with the way that we interpret these sounds. Getting the phase correct between the 2 mics is what makes us get a cohesive center image in our drum sound. So if these sounds are a bit out of phase, you'll get a snare drum sound that starts to get a little bit phasey. It starts to subtract from itself. If it was panned to mono, it would just mean that the snare would get a little bit thinner. But because it's stereo, it means that you start to lose the center image of the snare. You start to lose the feeling like the snare is right in front of you, and it almost starts to get surrounding you in some way. Now that, in some instances, could be a desirable sound, but it's a less realistic sound. It's kind of super realistic for the snare to be around you. It also sums to mono much better, which many people were still listening on mono systems at the time. The way that we deal with the phase on this is by measuring the distance between the microphones and the snare drum. We are picking the snare drum because that is one of the more impactful points, and we don't have an extra mic on it like we do in the kick drum, so that we really need all of the punch to be coming from the overheads. We take the overhead mic, we measure the distance. You can either do this with a measuring tape or you could just take a cable and just stick your finger where the capsule is. And then with our mic that's over on the shoulder side, you want to move the microphone around until the capsule is at exactly the same distance from the snare drum. Once you get that together, you're going to notice that immediately these 2 microphones lock in and they produce a really clear center image of a snare drum. For the overheads, we used the Mic Shop U47 clones. At the time, I think they may have been using 67s, but these are pretty similar. Just anything that has a really big tube mic sound is what you want so that you can get the full impact of the drums without anything getting thinned out. So for the kick drum, we used an AKG D12. We positioned it about 2 feet, 3 feet away from the kick drum. Part of this was just because of the late 60s mentality of not needing the kick drum to be that low endy. Another part was that Bonham was using an enormous kick drum. He was using a 26-inch kick with a closed front head, so it had a lot of length to it, and it had a huge amount of low end, and the truth is that there was no room for any of that low end to really exist in this mix. The further distance that we got away from the kick, the less that we were accentuating that low end with proximity effect. As for the processing, we kept it pretty simple. They were using a Helios console at the time, so we dug into the Kramer HLS by Waves. We were using that to mostly add a bit of high end and really take away a lot of low end. The mics themselves alone had way more low end than the recording, so we figured that they must have been pulling away a bit of that low end with the Helios. We added a tape emulator to all the tracks, which was the Studer by UAD. And then lastly, we added a bit of reverb. We don't know exactly what they were using when they mixed it, but chances are it was probably a EMT 140 plate. Today we use the Arturia emulation of that. So you'll notice that we have not mentioned any compressors thus far. We didn't use any. It was likely that they weren't using many at the time, or certainly not using them in creative ways, because that hadn't really become a very popular thing yet. All of the dynamics in this recording is coming from two things. It's coming from the player and the way that they are hitting the drums, and it is coming from saturation from the tape machine and how hard you are hitting that tape. That is allowing for some dynamic control. It is allowing for some extra punch in the transients, but it's not any compression in the traditional sense of what compressors do.
Next up, we have Fame by David Bowie, released on his 1975 record Young Americans, and the producer was Harry Maslin and the drummer was Dennis Davis. This marked a departure from Bowie's previous glam rock records and found him injecting elements of soul, funk, and disco.
On Fame, we start to hear where drums were headed in the latter half of the decade. The drums all start to get tighter and punchier. The stereo imaging starts to get much more pronounced, and because of that, all the elements start to get much more individual and separated from each other. The hi-hats in particular became a really unique part of this sound that sets the tone for the rest of the decade.
This track was recorded at the end of the Young American sessions and had a much more sparse arrangement than the rest of the record. Dennis Davis and the rest of the rhythm section did a lot of the heavy lifting on this tune, and the relaxed, sleazy groove they created is part of the reason that this track is so infectious. For the drums, we used a Ludwig Vista-like kick with the front head taken off and then stuffed with a blanket. Our snare is a Mapex Black Panther, and for the hi-hats, we used 14-inch Paiste 602 hats, and then for our crash, we had an 18-inch Zildjian Dark Crash.
So for the Bowie Fame sound, it is kind of building on the Zeppelin sound, but things are starting to get a little weirder. We are no longer just trying to record drums the way that they sound in a room. We're no longer trying to go for this photorealistic kind of drum sound. We're starting to really process them a little bit. We are also starting to treat the drums pretty substantially. We're starting to really shape the drums acoustically and have that translate a lot to the way that they are coming across recorded. We've started adding in a few more direct mics. We added a snare mic to this, so we have 2 overheads, a kick, and a snare. However, also, the relationship between the mics is starting to really change. So previously, our overheads, that was the sound of the drums. And the direct mics were meant just to add to them, right? You were not really taking the low end out of the overheads like you would do in a modern recording. You were leaving that low end and then letting the kick drum be largely coming from those overhead mics, and then the direct mic is just there to kind of supplement that kick drum sound. As we move through this decade, the direct mics start to become the actual sound of the drums, and the overheads start to just be cymbal mics in a lot of ways. They're just adding cymbal sound to this stuff. So we're doing a few things to make this sound happen. We are filtering the overheads for the first time. We are taking out a decent amount of low end. We are also adding a substantial amount of high end. We're really, really brightening these overheads up. Far more than we would ever do if they were our entire sound, because they would end up way too bright. But if we are brightening them up so much and then turning them down, the result is the cymbals just sound a bit thinner. They sound a little papery. They don't take up a ton of sonic space. And just the act of brightening them up and turning them down can give us that alone. It means that the snare drum sound is not really going to come from there. So the direct mic on the snare drum becomes completely essential. You take that mic away, the drums totally fall apart. The stereo imaging is kind of going hand in hand with that. So the stereo imaging previously, we were trying to get the snare drum super in phase and the snare drum to be a big focal point and the snare drum to feel centered. Now the overheads are becoming this completely other thing, and the snare drum sound of the overheads is no longer the reason for the overhead placement. And so people start placing their overheads with these kind of angles and starting to get the left and right to sound really, really different from each other. And the result is that the overhead sound gets wider and gets separated. It almost feels like certain things are overdubbed, and the reason that it feels that way is just because they are using the null points of the microphones to isolate what is in one overhead versus another. We're using the same mics on the overheads, the Mic Shop 47s. We are using a SM57 on the snare, and on the kick we switched from a D12 to an RE20. So for the processing on these mics, I used a bunch of plugins. I'm using the RS127 by Abbey Road, which is adding a ton of 10K. I'm using the Neve 1073 plugins, which are further shaping the EQ, taking away low end, kind of pushing certain aspects of the high end. And I am continuing to use my UAD A800 tape machine. All of these are pulling a lot more weight than they did in the Zeppelin song. The Zeppelin was much more minimal in the processing. Here we are really starting to process things a lot more. If you want to check out the specific settings, we're putting them all up on Reverb, and you can see exactly what I did. that was part 1 of our episode on the drum sounds of the 1970s.
Stay tuned for part 2, where we will be dissecting the drum sounds of Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, Stevie Wonder's Sir Duke, and please let us know in the comments what other drum sounds you'd like to see us break down. We'll see you next time.